Alright, you may have noticed as you booted up your systems that they are just hardware. They don't have an operating system installed. And so you can't really do too much with the hardware. We need an operating system. So for this class, we're going to use VMware's ESXi hypervisor as our primary OS for the hardware, and then we're going to install other guest OSs or virtual machines on top of that. So you can install ESXi either from a thumb drive, which is what I'm going to be doing today, using this little thumb drive, or you can grab a CD that has the ISO burnt on it. But get that in your computer, get it started up, and we'll take it from there. Alright, if all goes well, this is the first screen that you should see as far as the installer is concerned. And of course we're going to go ahead and hit enter on the installer. It'll take a little while for it to load up all of the required files and get the installer set up. And if you do this on a thumb drive, it'll be a little bit faster than if you do it on a CD or DVD. I think we have our first issue not supported. Alright, so 6.7 is out. Alright, so it looks like ESXi 6.7 is not supported on this hardware, so I'm going to try 6.5. Alright, so this is the installer for ESXi 6.5. And we're going to go ahead and hit enter. And then on the next screen, I think we hit enter again. It'll boot automatically. Enter will make it a little bit faster. Now, this is just essentially loading all the files needed for the installer. And it'll run faster on a thumb drive than it will on a CD DVD, but either one will work. Really? Alright, once the installer is loaded, you'll get to a screen that looks like this, which finishes up loading all of the necessary files. If you get any errors before you reach this screen, you may have to go back into BIOS and make sure that you have Intel virtualization technology enabled, as well as enhanced memory protection. That's in BIOS under the advanced CPU settings. You'll also notice that at this point, our CPU models are finally visible, which weren't visible in BIOS, but ESXi is smart enough to know what the actual CPU models are. This is also a good time to make sure all the memory that's supposed to be in your computer is being recognized by the operating system. For your machines, you should have 16 to 32 gigabytes. For mine, I only have 8 gigabytes installed, but ESXi is seeing all 8 gigabytes. It's okay if the installer pauses for long periods of time. It may take a minute or two for some of the larger files to actually be loaded into memory and processed. So don't be too concerned if it sits and hangs for a few minutes from time to time. Eventually you'll get to this screen, which is the beginning of the actual installer, where we have to give the computer some input in order to get through it. So most of the default options are going to be fine, but I'll walk you through it anyway. First thing we do, hit enter. Of course, we're going to accept this license agreement, so go ahead and hit F11. Now it's looking for devices that ESXi can be installed on. Now, if you've set up your computer much like I have, where I essentially have one RAID array of hard drives and nothing else, we're not going to have too many options where we can actually install this operating system. But if you want to use a thumb drive on that internal USB port, or if you have multiple RAID volumes with your hard drives, or some other place that you'd like to install it, that will appear here. Now, for the sake of this one, I've only got one, so I'm going to install it on the hard drives. But realize that this verbatim store and go is the thumb drive that I'm installing off of. I don't want to accidentally try and install to there. It won't like installing the operating system on the drive that it's trying to install from, because the first thing that it does is it wipes all of the data. So I'm going to select my hard drive and hit enter. And it'll make sure that we're okay with deleting all of the data on those drives, and in fact we are, so I'm going to go ahead and again hit OK. Yes, I do want my keyboard layout to be in the US layout. If you'd like to change yours, you may. Wouldn't recommend it though. And now we need to set a root password. Now realize that this is going to be critical to remember or to be able to recover later. So don't make this overly complicated, and don't forget it. This is very important. I'm going to use ProLiant, which is the model designation of these particular servers, and it's written right on the front, so it's easy to remember. Now, if this were actually a production environment, I would be choosing something significantly more secure, but since this is just an example and it's easy to remember that password, that's what I'm going to use. So capital P, lowercase r-o, capital L, lowercase i-a-n-t. And put that in again, ProLiant and ProLiant, and then we'll hit enter there. And that will be important to remember later. And 6.5 is too new. Let's go back to 6.0 then. Alright, so we had some issues with 6.5 and 6.7, so we're trying again with 6.0. Just set the password again for ProLiant, and hopefully this time we don't run into any issues. Alright, so it took a while, and I think that it's complaining about the extra network card that I have, but we're going to continue anyway and see what happens. So F11 to install. Looks good so far. Looks like we're almost done. It's taking a few minutes to get through. And there we go. So once we get to this screen, we can remove either the CD or the USB thumb drive and then hit enter to reboot. And it'll take a little while for the server to reboot, obviously. The computer should reboot into ESXi. If it doesn't, make sure that you have the right boot order and correct boot devices in BIOS. Should load up a little bit faster than booting off of the boot medium, because hard drives are going to be faster. If you used a thumb drive to install to, it might still be a little bit slower. This is booting off of a RAID 10 array of 6 SAS drives, so it's going to be pretty quick. Alright, and this is the primary landing page. This is kind of where ESXi sits. You'll notice that there doesn't seem to be a lot that we can do here. We can essentially hit F2 to customize or F12 to shut down restart. And that's essentially all that we can do from this graphical user interface. The power of ESXi comes across the network. So don't worry so much about that right now. But we do need to get networking working, and if you look at mine, I don't have any network cables plugged in, so I got a 0.0.0.0 IP address, which obviously doesn't really help. So I'm going to go ahead and hit F2 in order to customize. My login is going to be root, and that password is going to be ProLiant, which is what I'm set before. Hit enter, and that'll log me in. There we go. Okay. And so this is essentially all that we can do in the GUI, is just customize a few different pieces here. Now, if you plugged this server into a network that had a DHCP server on it, it would get an IP address. But since this server is not plugged into a network, it's not going to get an IP address. I need to set it manually. So I'm going to go ahead and set up my network address. First and foremost, I want to make sure, yes, that I have 2 NICs. Now I have an extra 2 NICs here, 2 and 3, because I've got an extra network card installed. Don't worry so much about that. You guys are just going to have 0 and 1 most likely. But I'm going to use VMNIC 0, which is the NIC 1 on the back of the computer. They're labeled 1 and 2 on the back. They're labeled 0 and 1 in VMware. Don't be confused by that. Go ahead and hit enter for that. And then I need to go over to the IPv4 configuration. Now, if you have a DHCP server that can configure this for you, awesome. Otherwise, we need to set it manually. So I'm going to use the arrow keys to get down to the set static IPv4 address, hit spacebar to select that, which will then allow me to go down to the IPv4 address. And I'm going to go ahead and use an IP address, hopefully that's different than what, oops, gotta have numlock on if you're going to use the keypad. I'm going to set an IP address that's hopefully different than my home network. Now, if your home network uses a 10 dot, use a 172 or a 192, but I'm going to go ahead and do this, and I'm going to make my ESXi server 10.0.0.5. Alright, this should be 255.0.0.0 for a 10 dot. It should be a 255.255 for a 172, or a 255.255.255 for a 192.168. Now, because I don't actually have a route out to the internet, which is what the default gateway here is looking for, I can leave this as all zeros, which essentially tells it has no hope of ever getting out to the internet, or I can make something up. I can tell it that that's the default gateway. If I do plug it into a network at this point, realize it's going to try and find that 10.0.0.1 device as a default gateway. It still won't be able to do anything, but just so that you're aware, it will try and look for that as a route to get out to the internet. Once I've got those settings there, I can hit enter and it will go ahead and save that, and then escape, and it'll ask if I want to apply those changes. So I'll hit Y for a yes, and then it will go back to my configuration. Now, this is pretty much all I can do from the GUI, which is why I need something else. I need another computer in order to interact with this particular server. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a laptop here. Okay, so I'm going to move this laptop right in front of you guys so that you can see what's going on. Again, this is the pinnacle of screen capture technology, is it not? All right. Now, of course, I need a network connection between this laptop and my ESXi. Whoa! Sorry, earthquake. So I need a network connection between this laptop and my ESXi server. So I'm going to go ahead and install an Ethernet cable between my laptop and that port 1 on the back of my ESXi server. Now, if your laptop does not have an Ethernet adapter, you're either going to need to get a USB to Ethernet adapter or figure out how to get your server onto your wireless network so that you can connect to it from your laptop wirelessly. Alright, so now that I have a physical connection in place, the next thing that I need to do is actually configure this laptop to use that wired connection. So I'm going to go to my Internet and Sharing, Ethernet, and you'll notice that it's connected, but it really doesn't know what to do with that connection because it doesn't have an IP address either. So I'm going to go ahead and change manually the IP address on that network. So IPv4, use the following IP, and I'm going to go ahead and say 10.0.0.4, 255, and then we'll give it the same default gateway. Windows won't let you set that to 000. It wants one on the same thing. So zoom in real quick for you guys to get that one. Hopefully you can see that. All right. Okay. All right. So we'll click OK on that. Click OK. And now if I open up my browser, I should be able to go to 10.0.0.5, which is my ESXi server or whatever IP address you set. And I may have to disable my wireless because that's actually on the same network. Disable the Wi-Fi, there we go. Alright, let's try that again. 1010, there we go. Should get a warning, and the reason for this is because it's trying to connect securely to a server that has what's called a self-signed certificate. Or in other words, it's saying, yes, I'm a trustworthy source, and your browser is saying you can't prove that you're a trustworthy source by citing yourself. Don't worry so much about that. We'll go ahead and click Advanced and then Accept Risk and Continue. I'm using Firefox. You can use Chrome or Edge as well. It should work. Alright, this is the old one. So in some of the newer versions, we can actually do all of what we need to do in working with ESXi from the browser here. But in this case, we can't, which stinks. Alright, so in order to work with this particular ESXi machine, we're going to need the vSphere client. So let me connect back to the internet real quick. So on the shared resources drive, so on the Google Drive that I've shared with you guys, there is a VMware vSphere client. That's the program that you are going to want to download. Grab that guy. So let's go ahead and install that vSphere client. Now we just run that program. So once you get the VMware vSphere client installed, it'll open up a dialog box that looks like this. We can go ahead and put in the IP address of our server. Username is root, and the password in the case of mine is ProLiant. Once you click log in, you may be presented with a message that looks like this. You can simply click ignore, or you can get the install certificate so it doesn't bother you each time. And it will load up a message like this. Now, the evaluation will expire in 60 days. Now, that's longer than the length of the rest of the course, so I'm not too worried about that. But if you do want to get a license for ESXi, you can apply for the free ESXi hypervisor license, which is indefinite, doesn't expire. You can use on as many machines as you'd like, and you can set that later. I'm going to move to another machine to do more of a walkthrough of this, but just to show you some of the stuff that's here before I move over to the other machine. You'll notice that on the summary page we've got information about the computer itself. How many cores we have, how much memory, different sockets, all of that information there. We also have a list of virtual machines, which is blank right now since we don't have any virtual machines on this particular computer. But I'm going to walk through more of this on another machine with some better screen capture so that you guys can see what's going on a little bit better. One last thing that I want to show you is that if you do need to shut down your server, you can hit F12, put in your password, and F11 or F2 will either restart or shut down your computer. If you have running virtual machines, you'll need to forcefully terminate them in order to make sure that it actually does shut down, but F2 will shut down the computer. So let's go ahead and get the vSphere client installed on your computer, and then we'll take a quick tour of it. So the first thing, once you've run that installer program, it will ask you for a language. You go ahead and select English, say OK. Oops, mine pulled over to the other screen. It'll be back in just a moment. Alright, now the default options are pretty much going to be what we need, but let's just walk through, accept our license agreement. You can change where you store it. For example, I like to store programs on a different drive on my main computer. Click install, and it will go ahead and install the program. Once the program is installed, you'll be presented with a dialog box that looks something like this. Now, you'll need to type in the IP address of the server that you are wanting to connect to. Realize that if you have multiple vSphere servers on the network, you can use this one tool to manage all of them from a single location, which is kind of nifty. We use the default username root. If you haven't set up additional usernames, that's going to be the default username. Well, we can add usernames later. Then put in the password. You'll be presented with this screen. From here, click on Inventory in order to access the server. Now, depending on the configuration that you used for your hardware, you may or may not have a data store. If you installed your ESXi installation on a thumb drive, your hard drives haven't been configured to store virtual machines for ESXi yet. However, if you did install it on a RAID volume, it oftentimes creates a data store on that RAID volume so that you can use the same location for storing virtual machines. We're going to come back to this in a little bit. I want to walk you through the tabs that are here across the top of the screen. The Summary tab shows me the information about the hardware of the server itself and its current usage. So you can see that I have a Supermicro machine, 16 CPUs, 32 logical processors, so 2 processor sockets, each with 8 core CPUs that are hyper-threaded. Now typically we want to disable hyper-threading for our virtual servers because virtual machines prefer physical cores to hyper-threads. But if you left it enabled, that's all right. We can also see the current usage of resources. Up here, you'll notice that I don't have any virtual machines running right now, so only the ESXi operating system is using the CPU, and it's using next to nothing of the available 16 cores that I have at my disposal. Similarly, I have 128 gigabytes of memory, of which ESXi is using about 2.5. Now that's fairly high for ESXi in general, and as more virtual machines get loaded, ESXi will actually remove some of the stuff that it has loaded into memory in order to optimize performance. On this page, we also have the ability to start creating new virtual machines or resource pools from the command section down here. Now, the new virtual machine will open up a wizard to allow us to create a new virtual machine. Resource pools are ways of allocating sets of resources, CPUs, memory, disk space, etc., to a specific set of virtual machines. We can also reboot and shut down the server from this page. Our Virtual Machines tab at the moment is going to be blank, but as we populate this machine with virtual machines, those virtual machines will be listed here, and we'll come back to those settings as we get virtual machines on this computer. Resource allocation also will show more information as we have virtual machines installed and running on this particular computer. The Performance tab shows the current usage of all of the particular system resources, CPU, memory, networking, etc. It can be useful for debugging why a server may be unresponsive or slow. The Configuration tab is going to be one of the most important, and so we're going to spend a lot of time here. Now, as you can see on the hardware side of things, we have several different categories of configuration we can look at. The health status, for example, will show us different statistics about the hardware inside of the computer. It is also on this tab that we can create the data stores needed to get rid of this error message that's up at the top. Persistent storage, or a data store, is required in order to store virtual machines. You'll notice that under View I have data stores and devices. If I switch over to devices, I can see all of the different devices. These are hardware drives that I have accessible. Now on this particular computer, I have several drives. I have a 120 gigabyte M.2 SSD. I have two 500 gigabyte SATA SSDs, a 7.5 gigabyte thumb drive, which is where my ESXi installation is installed, as well as a 4.5 terabyte hard drive array, which happens to be a RAID 6 array. Now, all of these hardware devices exist, but they're not yet usable by ESXi, and that's why we need to create data stores. So let's walk through the process of creating a data store in ESXi. I'm going to go ahead and click this link that says Add Storage. Again, most of our default options are going to be sufficient as we walk through this wizard. We are going to create a new disk. I'm going to click Next, and then I can select which disk I want. I'm going to go ahead and get my M.2 up and running with a data store. Click Next. It'll load the statistics about that particular drive. Now realize that all of the data on that drive is going to be removed when we create this data store. So make sure that the drives you're using can be erased before we click Next. In this case, this particular SSD actually has a Windows installation on it that I don't really care about anymore. So it's going to wipe out those partitions and replace it with the partitions needed for an ESXi data store. Next, I'm going to enter a name. Now, my common practice is to include some information about the performance of this particular data store so it's easy to reference later. For example, this one I'm going to call M.2 SSD 120, which tells me that it is an M.2 PCI Express SSD with 128 gigabytes of total storage space. Click Next. Then I can decide whether I want to use the entire disk or only part of the disk as the data store. And in this case, I do want to use the entire disk. So again, default option, maximum available space. And I click Next. It is then going to show me a summary of the settings that I've selected to make sure that I have done everything correctly. If you've followed through on all of the default options, there shouldn't be any issues here. We can click Finish, and it will go ahead and create that data store. Once you've created your data store, if you have additional drives, you can follow the same process to create additional data stores. Now, these data stores are essentially hard drives on your system. And if I want to see what files are on each of these different data stores, I can right-click and say Browse Data Store. Browsing the data store will open up a window that gives me a Linux-like tree showing all of the files that are on that particular drive. If I want to add files to this drive or download files to my computer, I can do that with the upload and download icons in this particular dialog box. For example, I want to create a folder of disk images that I'm going to use to install virtual machines. So I'm going to go ahead and click Add Folder, call it Disk Images, navigate inside Disk Images. Then I'm going to upload a folder that contains all of the files that I want. Now realize that this is going to move data across the network. So depending on your speed or your network connection, this may take a while. Fortunately, I'm on a gigabit switch, and so the data is moving rather quickly. It's also moving from an SSD on my computer to an SSD in the server, which is going to be significantly faster than moving from a hard drive or a thumb drive on one device to a hard drive or thumb drive on the other device. If it's taking a while for your files to upload, you can minimize that task and continue working with the vSphere environment as long as you don't remove that data store or make changes to it that would influence the download. Let's move on to networking. On the networking tab, you'll notice a simple diagram that shows you how ESXi is currently using your network. Now, this gray bar in the middle represents a virtual switch. It's essentially a multi-port switch built into the software that allows you to connect multiple internal devices to external adapters or other internal devices. So you'll notice that I have a physical adapter, VMNIC 0, which is the first networking device on my computer, and that's set up as my management network. That management network allows me to access this particular graphical user interface. There's also a VM network connected to this virtual switch. That VM network is my default network where virtual machines are going to be connected, which means that if I create a virtual machine with the default settings, not only will it have access to this physical network adapter and whatever network it's connected to, but that virtual machine can also access the management network, which can be kind of handy if you don't want to manage vSphere from your own computer, but would rather have a virtual machine set up that you can access and use these tools in. You can connect that to the VM network. Now, of course, because these servers have multiple network adapters, we can add multiple networks. So let's add a second separate network to this computer. I'm going to click on the Add Networking link. And again, most of the default options are going to be sufficient for this particular task. I'm going to create a virtual machine network. I'm going to use the next available network interface, so you will notice that VMNIC 0, a physical network adapter, is selected. Then I can create a network label, and I'm going to call this one separate network. You can come up with a more creative name if you would like. Click Next. It will show you what this new layout will look like. Click Finish. And now I have a connection. Now you'll notice the little red X indicates that there's not actually a connection on that physical adapter, and that's because I don't have that physical adapter plugged in. If I plug that physical adapter into a network, then that X will go away, and whatever is on this separate network will then be connected to that physical adapter and that physical network. Now, one more thing that we might want to do with networking is creating an isolated virtual machine only network. So once again, I'm going to click Add Network, use the default virtual machine. This time I am going to select or deselect the physical adapter so that there are no physical adapters connected to this virtual switch. And I click Next, and I'm going to call this one VM Isolated. And essentially what I have created here is a virtual switch that can exist between the virtual machines but has no access to the outside world. This is quite handy if I want to have a set of isolated virtual machines behind a firewall or a system that is not connected to the outside world in any way, shape, or form. We'll come back to these sorts of topics when we get to the networking section later in this course. If you do decide that you want to keep ESXi running longer than the 60-day period for trying it out, you can go to the licensed feature section and click Edit in order to add a license key. You'll have to get a license key from VMware, though the ESXi hypervisor license key is completely free. So let's go ahead and get started by creating a couple of virtual machines. Let's start with Windows Server 2019. I'm going to go ahead and click this New Virtual Machine button down in the Commands window on my summary page, and it's going to bring up a dialog box. Now, unfortunately, we're going to have to do a few things out of the default in order to configure this virtual machine for use in the vSphere client. Newer versions of ESXi actually use a web interface for interacting with and managing ESXi installations. And when they made that change from the vSphere client to the web browser-based management, They made it difficult to change settings inside of virtual machines that are created under the newer version. So I'm going to go ahead and click Custom here. Say Next, create a name. This is going to be CS318 Server 2019. Go ahead and call it that. You can choose a data store where I'm going to store this particular machine. Now, since I want it to be fairly fast, I'm going to go ahead and put it on one of my SSDs. Now, this next window, which chooses the virtual machine version, is incredibly important. We need to make sure that we choose virtual machine version 11 or older in order to maintain our control over the hardware resources of that particular machine. The newer versions are available and unlock newer operating systems, but they require the web interface in order to interact with and manipulate the settings of those virtual machines. So I'm going to select virtual machine 11 and click Next. I'm going to select Windows, and it is a Windows 2019, but because I've chosen an older version of the virtual machine environment, it doesn't know that Windows 2019 exists yet. However, Windows Server 2016 64-bit is pretty much identical to 2019 64-bit. So using 2016 64-bit will work in this case. Now I can choose what CPUs I want to give to my particular server. Now, one of the things that I like to do is give my virtual machines significant resources while I'm installing the OS, just to make the installation process a little bit faster. And then once I've installed the operating system, I'll scale it back to the resources that my operating system actually needs. In this case, a Windows Server installation might only need 2 cores and maybe 4 to 8 gigabytes of memory. But in order to increase the speed at which I install this particular virtual machine, I'm going to go ahead and give it 8 cores and 64 gigabytes of memory. Next, I set up networking. Now I can choose where I want this virtual machine to exist. Remember, we created multiple networks under that networking tab. So if I want this network or this virtual machine to exist on my management network or the physical network that I have connected, I should select VM network. However, if I want it on the second network that we created, which has access to the physical network but doesn't have access to the management network, I should choose separate network. If I want this one to be completely isolated or off of the physical network and completely virtual, I can choose VM isolated. Because I'm going to want to run Windows updates and have internet access, and I haven't connected a physical cable to that separate network yet, I'm going to go ahead and select VM network. Realize at this point I can also have multiple network interface cards. When it comes to the SCSI controller, always go with the default. If you change this, it may cause significant issues for the operating system installation later. I'm also going to create a new virtual disk since I don't already have one created. And I'm going to make that disk 500 gigabytes thin provisioned. Now remember that there's a big difference between thick provision and thin provisioning. Thick provisioning allocates all of the space for that particular virtual machine from the onset, which means that if I make a 500 gigabyte drive, 500 gigabytes of storage is reserved for that virtual machine. Thin provisioning allows my virtual machine to only use the amount of storage that it needs, up to 500 gigabytes. This is a great option if you don't know how large the virtual machine is going to get over time and want to give it some room to grow. Keep in mind, however, that if you have multiple thin provision virtual machines on a drive, it's possible to oversubscribe the storage space on that drive and cause problems if those virtual machines exceed the real storage space of that drive. Also note that I can store this drive on different disks within my system. Now, if you only have one disk, you won't necessarily have the option to store it on a separate data store. But in this particular system, I have 3 other data stores that I could store this disk on. If I want to give my computer or my virtual machine multiple drives to work with, I can store those on separate data stores, meaning separate physical drives within the system. For now, I'm going to store it with the virtual machine, which means on the same drive that I initially selected to store the virtual machine configuration file. I'm going to leave the settings on the next page as the default, but you may want to look into these settings as they can enhance or change the performance of that particular virtual machine. The last page gives me a summary of the options that I have selected so far. Before I click Finish, I want to select the box that says Edit the Virtual Machine Settings. This will allow me to tweak a couple of the final hardware settings in that virtual machine before the virtual machine is created. I'm going to click Continue, and it will give me this window that looks very familiar if you're used to VMware Player. You'll notice all of the hardware that is being added to the machine is already laid out. If I want to go back and change anything at this point, I can. The other thing that I can do is select a boot up image in order to install the operating system. So if I collect the CD or DVD, I can select a data store ISO file. I'll browse to that folder that I uploaded earlier, which is on that one, disk images, and then I can select Windows Server 2019. I can select the ISO that I want to install from and click OK. Then I want to select the checkbox that says Connect at Power On. Otherwise, while the disk is in the drive, it won't actually connect that virtual device to the virtual machine, and then I won't be able to boot off of that drive. Then I'm going to click Finish, and it will go ahead and create that virtual machine. Now you'll notice that that virtual machine has popped up over here in the left-hand side. If I select the virtual machine, I get a different summary page that shows me the details of that particular virtual machine as it's been created. You'll notice that it is not powered on at the moment. I can power it on here. However, I'm going to use a snap-out window in order to interact with that particular virtual machine before I power it on. This icon right here will launch a virtual machine console in a separate window. This window will allow me to interact with and control that virtual machine much like I would in VMware Player. I'm now going to turn the virtual machine on by pressing the play button, and you'll notice that it loads into the installer almost immediately. Clicking into the window will actually capture my cursor inside of the console. I may have to hit Control-Alt in order to get my cursor back into my host operating system. Let's walk through the Windows Server 2019 installer real quick. I'm going to click Next and Install Now. At this point, I'm going to select that I don't have a product key. This will allow me to use Server 2019 in an evaluation mode for up to 180 days. Because I don't have a product key, the installation needs to know what version of the operating system I want to install. Now I can choose either Standard or Data Center. Data Center has a lot more features, allows larger sets of hardware, but is unnecessary for what we're going to be doing. So we're going to stick with Standard. We're also going to select the Standard Desktop Experience. Now realize that the Standard option only installs a command line interface and doesn't have any of the graphical components that we would normally expect when installing or working with a computer. Now in future installations, you may opt for that since it makes for a lighter weight operating system, and you may be more comfortable with those features. But in order to get you familiar with the roles and features of servers now in a more comfortable environment, I'm going to recommend installing the desktop experience. Click Next, accept the license agreement, and click Next, and then select Custom. Now, because we only have a single drive in this system, we're going to use that for installation. But if we had multiple drives or we wanted to create separate partitions, this is where we would do that before installing the operating system. I'm going to click Next, and it will begin installing Windows. Now, I'm moving from an SSD to an SSD, so the installation should be quite quick. But while this is working, I'm going to get another virtual machine up and running. We'll come back to this one later. So let's go ahead and create another virtual machine. This time I'm going to right-click on my server IP address and say New Virtual Machine. Again, I'm going to create Custom. This is going to be a pfSense virtual machine. So let's go ahead and name it CS318 pfSense. pfSense is a firewall version of Linux that will allow me to essentially isolate all the virtual machines that I'm creating from the rest of the network so that the services that we enable don't negatively impact the rest of the network that we're connected to. I'm also going to store this on an SSD. I'm going to make it a virtual machine version 11. And I'm going to select Other FreeBSD 64-bit. which is what's going to be required for pfSense. Now, pfSense is a significantly lighter operating system. I'm going to go ahead and give it 2 cores. I'm also going to give it 4 gigabytes of memory. Now, our pfSense machine actually needs multiple network adapters. So I'm going to go ahead and select 2, and I'm going to put NIC1 on my VM network, which will give me my external connection. And I'm going to put NIC2 on my isolated network so that it's only connected to virtual machines within the environment and doesn't have access to the external world in any way, shape, or form. Then I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Again, I'm going to leave the defaults for the SCSI controller. And I'm going to create a new virtual disk, 20 gigabytes thin provisioned. Leave the defaults here. Edit the virtual machine before completion. Click Continue. And I'm going to add a data store ISO file to my CD/DVD drive. And I'm going to use my pfSense installer image for that one. Connect it, power on. I think I'm going to leave the rest the same. Click Finish. Let's go back and check on Windows. There we go. So Windows has run through the installer, and I think it's rebooting for the first time after successfully installing Server 2019. All right. Let's create an administrative password. Now realize that you're going to have to create a rather secure password for Server 2019 because it does not like insecure passwords. It actually enforces particular lengths and character sets. I'm going to use the password ProLiant G5, which I'm hoping will meet the complexity requirements of this particular server. And it does. In order to log into the server, we're going to have to hit Control-Alt-Delete. However, if you hit Control-Alt-Delete on a Windows machine, it will actually perform the Control-Alt-Delete on the Windows 10 machine, not on the virtual machine. Instead, you should hit Control-Alt-Insert, and that will perform a Control-Alt-Delete inside the virtual machine. We'll use that same password that we just created, and the computer will log us in. Now, the neat thing about Windows Server is that it presents us with the Server Manager dashboard right from the get-go, which tells us what we need to do in order to configure our server and actually start using it. But we're going to hold off on adding roles and features until later. Let's go back to our pfSense machine and see if we can't get that up and running. The computer will go ahead and boot into the pfSense installer. Again, walking through this installer, we'll typically use the default options, but let's walk through it together. I'm going to go ahead and hit Enter for accepting, I for installing, and OK. I'm going to continue with the default map. I'm going to allow it to configure the disk automatically. When it asks if I want to make any manual configuration changes, I'm going to go ahead and say no. And that's it. I can go ahead and click Reboot. The computer will then reboot into pfSense. Alright, pfSense is now fully booted. This page tells us what we can do with pfSense, which is very limited from this aspect. Realize that pfSense has a web GUI that allows us to actually interact with it in a much more intuitive way. For now, all that we need to know is that we have a DHCP address on the WAN side, which means that this computer is getting internet, and we have a static IP address, 192.168.1.1, on the internal network. Now, DHCP is enabled by default, so let's move our Windows server over to this isolated network behind pfSense and see if it can get an IP address and get a connection out to the internet. I'm going to hit Control-Alt to release my mouse cursor from my pfSense machine, and I'm going to pull up my Windows server. And I'm going to go into my network settings on my server, and check to see what the current settings are. Now currently, my server has an IP address of 10.3.5.212, which is on the staff network, or the network that I'm physically connected to. I want to move this to behind my pfSense machine, so it should get a 192.168 address. In order to change the networking, I'm going to change the settings of this virtual machine by going to VM, Edit Settings. I can then select my network adapter and change the network label from VM Network to VM Isolated, which is the inside port of my pfSense machine. I'm going to click OK, and you'll notice that my network has changed. Go ahead and click Next here, close out of that so that I can refresh, and sure enough, I've got a 192.168.1.100 IP address, and my default gateway is 192.168.1.1, which was in fact the IP address of my pfSense machine. So let's go ahead and see if we can actually access the web interface for my pfSense machine and get the setup for that virtual machine finalized. I'm going to open up Internet Explorer and type in 192.168.1.1. Clicking through all of the error messages that Explorer will come up with, I'm going to get another error that says that the site is not secure. I'm going to click More Information and select Go to the web page anyway. And finally, I'll be presented with the login page. By default, the username and password for pfSense is admin and pfSense. Hopefully I did that right. Click Sign In, and it will take me to a wizard to set up the rest of pfSense. I can click Next, Next again, and I can give it a name. If I want to change DNS settings, I can, or I can leave them as the default. If I want to give my WAN interface a static IP address, I can set that here. However, for my configuration, I want to actually leave it DHCP so that I get an address from the network that I'm connected to. I am also going to deselect this block RFC 1918 private networks because I have a private network on the WAN side of my pfSense machine, which if you've connected this to your home network, you may also have. I can also change the LAN IP address at this point if I want to, but realize that if I do that now, I will lose my connection to this wizard and I'll have to start the wizard over. I can also change the password. Now I'm going to go ahead and use Proliant again here just to make it easy to remember. When all of that's done, I can click Finish. And I'll be presented with a dashboard that shows me the information about this particular server. If you'd like to update your pfSense machine, you can. Something that will help pfSense run a little bit better, since it is a virtual machine, but it doesn't yet know that it's a virtual machine, is installing the VMware tools. On pfSense, we can do that by going to System, Package Manager, clicking on Available Packages, and scrolling down to Open VM Tools. Click Install and Confirm. Once the installation is complete, we can go back to the home page. I'm going to clean up my dashboard a little bit by getting rid of the Netgate services and support. And I'm also going to add a traffic monitor. so that I can see the usage on my particular server, which right now is very light. Now realize I'm doing this within the Windows Server virtual machine using the web browser of that Windows Server virtual machine to interact with the actual machine, which is over here. And as I make changes in that browser, those changes are replicated to the virtual machine over here. Hitting enter will bring me back to the home page of the pfSense virtual machine. Let's create some traffic on that VM network so that we can see that our Windows Server is really going through our pfSense virtual machine. I'm going to go ahead and click the Home tab and scroll down. Sorry, this is under Settings. I'm going to click on the Updates and Security and check for updates. Now, since this is a fresh install of 2019, there should be a significant amount of updates available. And sure enough, I now have a list of updates that are going to begin downloading. You'll also notice in the background that the traffic graph for my pfSense machine is changing as these particular items are being downloaded. For example, we just had a spike up to 50 megabits per second as it downloaded one of the particular update packages. We'll see additional spikes as each of these are updated. Okay. So now you should at least be a little bit more comfortable with the vSphere client and ESXi. Now realize from this point forward, you don't have to touch your server at all. You can interact with all of the things that you need to interact with from your laptop or another computer that has this vSphere client installed on it.